So our aim today has been to not only shake up thinking about what the problems are, which we're somewhat aware of, I'm sure, looking at the folks in the room. Mark Adelson, for example, has long worked in housing, experienced town planners like Maureen O'Mara and others, but also shake up thinking about action. And that's why when Ann and I discussed the session, and she told me about some of the things she was learning about regarding community land trusts, we thought we would throw out one example of a model that might look different when it's developed here, or it might look more like the kinds of things that Freeport has done, but the need is to think about what the possible actions may be. And if you'll just forgive me for a second while I try and find the right PowerPoint here. Goodbye, Bruce. And sorry to see you go. And let me just open this up. So we have a couple of questions we'd like to discuss with you today. And the acoustics are pretty good in this room. If you will speak up, we'll be able to pick them up on our recording as well. I'm going to give this mic back to the panel here. Josh, if you can see, you can get that to me. So, what do you think? What would you like to ask our panel or raise as an added thought here? Mark.
Well, for the panelists, is market rate rental housing? Well, you wanted me to stand up.
No, I want you to speak up.
Okay, speak up. Is market rate rental housing coming back, and is that good in Portland, because that's where I work? And is that good or bad for affordable housing needs?
Please.
I was at a Maine Real Estate Developers Association meeting at noon today, and there were a couple of developers there that are doing market rate apartments. And certainly, when I was reading about the high rises on Marginal Way and the several hundred units and stuff that are going to occur there, caused me a little pause for our organization as we're constructing 60 affordable ones about 100 yards away. You know, so how much of a market is it here? My sense is all housing in Portland is good. Development of any housing in Portland is good. And that there is a market for apartments. I think there are a lot of empty nesters that are realizing that maybe this American dream of owning your home is not that at all. And so I think there's a movement from home ownership to rental for the higher end, which, you know, I pointed that slide that says basically it's just poor people living in apartments. I think that's going to shift. And so I think it's a good thing. I think any way to increase the supply of housing is good. And so I think more high-priced apartments is very good. I think there is a demand for it. And I think it will take some of the pressure off the lower-end market, frankly, and then free up more opportunity for those who need affordable.
Before we go there, John.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that based upon our properties and the demand that we've got for market rate, there's definitely a healthy appetite. Down the street from the Baxter, where Justin Alfond and Greg Schimberg did that building, you know, every time I talk to them, it's full, and it's small efficiencies. You know, the parking, they've got parking, we don't have parking on some of ours, so it's been interesting to see. I think that the rents for the higher end, as Dana was saying, are now getting to the point where you can justify the construction, but they weren't there before. So, and what I kind of see happening is in the next couple of years, there's going to be what is currently the upper end of apartments in Portland, the nicer ones, which really are not that, you know, nice if someone's moving here from Boston or say, or selling a house, they don't have the space and the amenities. Those are going to become the second tier, which I think will be good because they're going to have to, you know, rents are going to be more competitive and they're going to have to be more competitive. So I think that they'll kind of cover a section of that, you know, 120% AMI market, which will be, I think, a positive thing.
Great.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue Inches, and I'm here on behalf of Habitat for Humanity of Maine. So thank you, Donna. Great endorsement of the Freeport project. So I've been thinking, I'm new to housing, but thinking a lot about home ownership and especially for workforce housing and that kind of thing. And there's a couple of things that I haven't heard here today. And one of those is interest rates are at an all-time low. There's also a lot of distressed properties on the market, residential homes that are pretty cheap. And so low interest rates, lots of inexpensive housing, and then the third sort of factor is a lot of people have credit issues. So it strikes me that those are all factors that need to be in this affordable housing discussion, and that it suggests some kinds of solutions having to do with helping people get into those homes. You know, maybe it's rent-to-own programs or some way of kind of pulling all those factors together into some kind of program that would serve people. So I'd just be interested in the panelists' comments about that, because I haven't heard that side here.
It's a provocative question. Folks, any thoughts?
Sure. I think that's actually an area where kind of what Ann was talking about in terms of the public-private sector, or the public sector can do a lot there to help. I know that in Sanford in particular, they use the first couple rounds of the NSP funds, the neighborhood stabilization funds, to buy some of these foreclosed homes and then renovate and resell them. I think that if you look to, a first-time home buyer, for instance, to buy a home like that, it's going to be difficult if they're under foreclosure or short sale to get, they don't have the money, they don't have cash. So to get financing to make that happen, I think is a difficult process. But I think it's a great opportunity, and wonder myself when I see some houses if that couldn't happen.
Right. Yeah, I just would say a couple of things. And one is that, just to reiterate what I said earlier, which is, and what Dana said too, is we have to be strategic about where we, where we invest our resources. And if that affordable home is on the, way outskirts of town, it's probably not the right home to be investing in. But the other thing, but I think there are some opportunities that are closer into town that probably do make sense. And that's where, some sort of land bank or property bank would be helpful to try and grab those opportunities while we have this window of low interest rates and relatively lower costs. But then the other thing is that there are CLTs that are doing, lease to purchase kinds of programs, and so that I think we can look at creatively mixing and matching strategies in order to take advantage of the opportunities that exist.
I'm curious about a quick question. Is Habitat part of the Regional Housing Council?
No.
So maybe you need to have a discussion with Sue Inches.
I already asked her. She said no.
You asked her if she wanted to join, she said no?
No.
No, don't put her as well. So it's just something.
I'll ask her again.
Yeah, we'll ask her again.
Right.
Come on, Sue.
Dan?
At Avesta Housing, we have long championed rental housing and housing for lower-income folks. Almost to some degrees, fighting those that were promoting home ownership, and because we thought too much attention was going there. But at the same time, we just opened up a home ownership center. And there's two focuses, and many states have these. They're much more active and present in some areas than others. But first is there are many distressed homeowners that really need to find their way out in a most painless way. So for some, it's foreclosure counseling, budget counseling, trying to help them restructure their loan to either stay in the home or to get them out. But another key part of the homeownership center is to make sure that all those who are going to become homeowners do so responsibly so they can sustain that, so that the experience that we've had over the last 3-4 years doesn't repeat itself. And so now more than ever, banks want people to have that home buyer counseling, that home education, if they go in with their eyes wide open. And so I think we're just looking at home ownership in a very different way now. I mean, for many of us, it's like, oh, this is just an investment. It may even be my retirement investment. You buy it, it shoots up in value, and in 6 ways you get all your equity parked. now when people are buying a home, they really want to buy it for perhaps different reasons. They either want their own land, they want to be able to have that independence that they keep their way, stuff they can't do when they're a renter. So really, I think preparing people to become homeowners in perhaps a different way and more responsible way is important. So that's what we're doing. And frankly, the phone's ringing off the hook for people looking for that guidance.
Other thoughts or questions for a panel? Yes.
Working with regional public transportation, I would think would be incredibly important with the job insecurity today. If someone loses their job in Portland, can they get up to Freeport and Brunswick? Soon they will. Or can they get down to Sanford? If we want to keep people in these homes, the transportation costs, as Dana mentioned, are really important. And the regional public seems a long way off from being really usable.
Since Carl Eppick's here from PAX, I'm going to put him on the spot. Knew this was coming. Any comments?
Yeah, it was good to hear that. I think it was Dana at the beginning, or one of you at the beginning, talked about. This wasn't something that was factored in most, or still isn't really. It's on the radar though. That is the cost of housing, transportation as it relates to where you live. And yeah, I've been involved with this Sustain Southern Maine effort since we applied for the grant, and that was actually going to be one of my questions, which is how is the development community, municipalities, nonprofit developers, how much has it permeated into your calculus with doing projects? That is the cost of energy. And we, as far as on the house, on the building side of the equation, I think that's there. But we're at $4 gas and it's going up. And I don't know, last time I looked, the cheapest new car you can buy is about $17,000, which I remember not too long ago that was a luxury car. So I in the context of this project, Sustain Southern Maine, how might your type of entities working with this consortium with regionally address the cost of transportation, and how do you integrate that with municipal, local, that's a private developer planning for housing? And have you seen a movement in that direction?
It's not too hard in some communities, and other communities it's pretty difficult. A couple of examples. As Josh mentioned, we manage Justin Alphonse 645 Congress Street building. And essentially, you rent your apartment. If you want a parking place, you could pay more for that. So it really attracts and sort of discourages people to have cars. We built some artist apartments on Oak Street. 37 units, we have 8 parking places. You don't provide the parking, people don't show up with cars. And so, it's kind of hardball to some degree, but that's Portland. It's far different when we're in Yarmouth or Kennebunk or Wyndham or Gorham. We certainly check with regional transportation, particularly for the seniors, with RTP and others to find out what their bus routes are and to try to make sure we're on those. In some of our developments, we're exploring providing the zip cars and the car sharing and some of the other alternatives. But we're doing what we can, but you boil it all down, it means we'll state, and so there's no easy answers for the Yarmouths or the Gorhams or the Wyndhams.
Other comments from the panel? And then Josh.
Providing a share car at a multi-family facility, has that ever come up? Or private or
we're exploring it at Oak Street. I think because the city has that zip car program thing going, we've tried to get those parked nearby our buildings, and so we're able to promote that as a viable option. So I think the future of that type of approach is really huge. It's happening all over the place in other cities, particularly with students and young folks in Boston and Philadelphia. So I think there's a real future there. Again, we have a critical mass in Portland, but I think, I think gradually our independence in Maine is starting to fight with our, what's the word, we're cheap. And so we may be on the independent route. So we may be independent, but we're also frugal, and so maybe, I'm willing to share a little bit in the cost of that car. So I think it's a little bit of a change that's going on slowly.
John?
I think that issue enters into our calculus for commercial and residential. One of the reasons we like doing projects in Portland is because of the good public transportation center system, and that we know that if gas goes to $7 a gallon, there's still a way for people to get to work, and that's not going to cause our tenant to have problems and then tell us that they need to move out and then we have to vacant buildings. So it's kind of that impacts that. With Sanford, York County Community Action got a great grant from the transportation, Federal Transportation Authority, and they're putting their transit hub across the street from our mill, and that made a huge difference, kind of from our perspective, our lenders' perspective, our investors' perspective, in terms of the viability of that mill. I know, their buses are there now. Their transportation system, but it's not this centralized, modern facility. And when they made that decision earlier this year, that was a nice jumpstart when we were trying to convince people that this mill would work, because they can work all along York County and they can live at our mill. We have 36 units. We don't open until June. We have 61 people on the wait list today. So, one of the big things that we tout is that transportation center is going to be there, and I think it's a big thing for us.
Sir.
Piggybacking on the transportation.
Just speak up, please.
Oh, sorry. Piggybacking on the transportation piece, specifically the planner from Freeport, have you evaluated whether or not reducing or eliminating parking requirements is viable in Freeport? I mean, I know as a developer, that's just providing a minimum amount of parking, being required to provide a minimum amount of parking is an extra burden that increases housing costs maybe more than they need to. So just to you, is that on the radar, especially as Freeport becomes more walkable and a lot of jobs and restaurants?
The parking is certainly an issue in Freeport because it is totally auto-dependent. We have no public transportation. A number of years ago, we reduced our parking requirement for village apartments, so that in response to that, so that they didn't have to provide quite as many parking spaces. But it's definitely a problem. We look at our employee parking. We have employee parking requirements. It's a very complicated mix of how parking is provided. So we are working on it, but in the absence of any public transportation, which we're also working on, but it's very controversial, and the train has used so many resources that would otherwise, have created a whole new set of expenses for the town, that I think it's going to slow that down. So it's a problem, but I don't have a good solution for it right now. It's all very political, too.
Yes, sir. Can you tell us who you are?
John Cressy, Gorham Town Council. As a town councilman for Gorham, I've been very much following the Gorham East-West Corridor study, and one of the recommendations of the study is to create transportation-oriented development areas. And with population growth expected by the study by Professor Colgan, 70% of the growth of the whole state of Maine is going to be in the Cumberland and York counties. There seems to be a chicken and the egg issue going on with the transportation oriented development idea, because in order to attract people to that type of development, the transportation system needs to be in place, I think. whether it be light rail or a bus service. But in order to afford to have the light rail or bus service there needs to be a certain amount of population existing already before they'll supply it. So there seems to be a major chicken or the egg situation there. Do you guys have any ideas on how to solve that?
Please.
Well,
Ask Carl.
Well, the bus systems and following the Brunswick to Portland Amtrak thing as well. Whether or not our transportation system is going to be self-sufficient, or whether or not our government wants to invest and subsidize these transportation systems because that transportation provides many benefits in addition to just getting people from place to place, I think is a question. So it is a key part of the question. So I think, frankly, the government will need to continue and wisely invest in public transportation. And so I'm not sure for states like Maine that will ever really have the critical mass to make it feasible, as I think you've illustrated. But I think it will take some sort of government subsidy, whether that's federal or state or local, what combination, I don't know. But I think at some point, we as a society might say it's in our best interest. You know, it's a way of keeping cars off the highway, it's a way of filling us with whatever the issue might be. I think it's probably going to take some increased level of government participation in our transportation program.
And let me just...
I would also respond to that. I think one of the things that we get stuck in whenever we talk about this is that we think really big system stuff, so we're going to take the leap from everybody driving their own car to a light rail system. That's really big, and we really are a long ways, in my opinion, from the population needed to support that. But we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's the transition. Okay, so 100 years, light rail. But what's the transition process between now and then? What are the other options that are available to us? And I think those are the questions that we're not talking about, because there's probably some solutions in there to get us, a little less auto-dependent in the meantime. And that's just sort of a quick comment.
Actually, it's a great lead into something I wanted to say to kind of interject this, but it's kind of a wraparound. And the point about the train, the train, it's easy to get organized. We're going to take the train to Brunswick. So then all the effort, a lot of resources get into getting it set up in Freeport and Brunswick, and as was pointed out, that couldn't be applied to maybe some other things, whatever they might be. Well, this panel today is not the end; it's the beginning of this discussion. The nature of the sustained, put on my other hat here, the nature of the sustained Southern Maine initiative is to bring these things together. So there have been questions about transportation. Well, this is not the PACS crew in here, except for Carl. And energy connects, and this is not the energy crew necessarily, some, but those have to be brought together, and there is a mechanism. As a specific part of this project, there's been a regional housing council created, and I haven't been able to make any of the meetings myself to listen, but who here is a member of that? Josh, Dana, others? So a few people, but
panel.
This
the panel.
So this discussion needs to be brought into that group, and they need to assess it. We'll be giving them a written report. They're giving everybody a written report, but particularly for that group, they need to then say, oh, okay, so now what should we think about, and who else should we connect with? So this is just a little bit of a hard-headed, advertisement about this aspect. That's why we're doing these.
Yeah.
Rather than being outside on a lovely pre-fall day, is to start to talk across. So we're doing good on time without wearing everybody out. Any more comments or questions, Carl?
A place where housing and transportation and this effort all come together. Somebody said earlier, every time the cost of gas goes up 10 cents, it's $100 million. Even if it's not that much out of our economy, that's really where the rub is on this. The housing problem, the transportation problem, providing transit-oriented development, as JP was just talking about, it comes down to economic sustainability. I think, when we talk about each of these things individually, really, this effort is about talking about them and how they interact. And that one, the 10 cents per gallon thing illustrates it best for me. And I think that's something that everyone can get their head around, if that's actually an accurate number, even if it isn't, if it's something along that magnitude. Because, that in my head, that means if gas goes up $1, that's $1 billion. How many billions do we have to give up in our economy here in Maine?
Charlie, what's the gross state product a year? 3 billion? 44 billion. 44 billion. All right, so we got quite a ways to go. So we get to zero.
But it wouldn't take that long.
But you see my point. I mean, you can quickly impact it, 5-10% with $1, $1 jump in gas, and so that's where the focus on the importance, I think, of everything that this effort's trying to do with combine work near where you live and connect it all, make trips, many more trips, not with the car, not with increasing gas costs. We're always going to need cars, but more trips that are not in the car.
So I think some of the themes we've heard here today are, to feed them back, are, one household at a time, maybe not having the same costs or as many trips, and maybe better health and quality of life and the impact on the rest of the community. One project at a time, being able to work with a municipal government and other members of the capital stack who have to be lined up, particularly those evil underwriters who are so hard to please. And one community at a time. Freeport, when I talk with Donna about what Freeport's done, it's very complicated. It takes a lot of time to forge those relationships because they're small steps, which is part of Donna's message today. You have to get them together and add them up, and then they start to add up to something. And I think that final theme is organization. A lot of this is about bringing the players together of all kinds, not just private and public and nonprofit, but also across sectors, the transportation crowd, the energy crowd, the land use crowd, the housing crowd, and the money people.
And the regulators.
And the regulators, there's a number of those involved.
I would think that the regulators would be a good addition to the conversation, because in like the 40 years, whatever it is that I've been dealing with affordable housing, I've watched it go from, easy to create to almost impossible to create, largely on the backs of regulation. And I don't just mean new rules and regulations, I also mean bureaucracy and the soft costs that are, and the time costs associated with just getting through it. And I just wonder if in this context, you'd have the voice of the regulators, or is there a way to have a group that could impact and make them understand what that does to the affordability. You can't create it in the first place. You can't sustain it.
Rebecca's going to have a response to that. Could you share with people what wonderful place you're from?
Oh, sorry. I'm from Standish, and I've been on the planning board for 15 years, and I've been knee-deep in the planning process for comprehensive plan and zoning changes.
Standish, America's finest, leading the way. The home of the model town project.
Place for transportation.
So Rebecca does have a response to that.
Maybe not a fabulous response for you, but one of the things that we've been charged with by HUD is looking at particularly the policies surrounding our funding streams. And it gives us an opportunity, I hope, to look back at them as well, to say, well, we looked at local issues and we've created some. I love the fact that the first three of you who spoke today have policy ideas, and that's fantastic. So it gives us a place to start from and say, okay, we looked at local level, we sort of said, we need this from you. We have to look at the state level as well. Okay, that even feels doable. But there is some aspect of having to look back at the feds themselves and say, okay, we're working on these things, and we need you to do this. All 45 grantees have been asked to do this, so my hope is that you'll have 45 collaborations from across this country who maybe have some collective voice of turning around and saying, this doesn't work. I'm hoping we have some voice. I can't predict, I can't see the future, so I don't know how strong it will be.
I
But
just think it should be part of the
But they've
effort.
asked for it, so.
Other comments?
Did you have a question up there?
Did I miss something, Connie?
No, I do have a question though, and you know where I work, so. I think everyone in this room understands that the gap used to be this big between income and housing costs, and now the gap is this big. But when you go out and talk to the public that way, you're talking to the people that all pretty much own their own homes. And they remember that emotional moment when they struggled and they signed the papers and they bought their house, and they all say, well, I had to struggle to, collect the money to buy a house. And they don't believe you when you say the gap is bigger now. So is there any insight you have in trying to elevate that discussion?
That's really good.
Well, 20-some years ago when I came to Maine, I was having those discussions with, town planning boards and councils and select boards and stuff, and it just has gotten worse. And so, but it's not that, that problem has existed for a long time. What I tried to do then was to do models that showed, for a median priced house, what your down payment would need to look like and those kinds of things. But Maine, because I think in part because in part it is such a high home ownership state, and people are so invested in that. That's what they have always known, and they just assume that it's going to happen. But I do think it can be powerful to just come up with those models or illustrations. And talking to younger people is sometimes a really good way to go. I mean, I once addressed a class at University of Maine Farmington of college-age kids, and I just said, well, who among you lives in a house that your parents own? Well, most of the hands went up. And then, well, how many of you want to own a house or expect to own a house when you get a little older? And most of the hands went up. And I said, well, let's talk about what you're going to have to do, what that looks like for you, using some assumptions about what housing costs and down payment and that kind of thing. And I mean, some of them were practically in tears at the end. Really? So, I think sometimes talking to the parents, you're right, maybe, you might hit a bit of a wall, but talking to the folks like Josh, who are out there in the marketplace and really looking at the gap between their incomes and housing costs, and they're the ones who can tell you. And the other thing, there are a few things have changed, and one is healthcare costs, and that's a huge difference from even 20 years ago, yeah.
I think, the economics of all this are often very hard for people to understand. That's why Charlie looks so glum a lot of the time. trying to explain. But I think, making this connection, and I say that fondly, but making this connection between the economic prosperity of the region and the state and housing is something that needs to happen. And it's not intuitive to those people that over time it can affect their lives. But Maureen has, of course, as usual, put her finger right on kind of the electric issue in trying to get consent, public consent to do things, to change things.
Can I just add one small comment, and that is 30 years ago when people my age bought their first house, I don't know how many of us have ever had to put down 20%, and even at housing prices back then, we wouldn't have been able to. I mean, there were lots and lots of programs that reduced the down payment, and most of those aren't around anymore.
We also started out with more debt. It's 20 years ago. My parents worked their way through college because you could work all summer, make enough money to pay your in-state tuition for the year. You can't do that anymore. It's absolutely impossible to do that. So we already start in the hole before we're even, this conversation about taking on more debt and figuring out how to find I think this conversation about what the gap is multi-layered. There's a lot of different things that are part that make up that gap.
But I think there's a lot of pieces that you can use to communicate that. So that's a really good thing.
So does our panel have some final comments on that?
Just on that, I think for a number of years I worked in the job training world, and there was sort of a feeling that, well, if you put your best foot forward, you're not able to hold a job. And if somebody wasn't working, then they really weren't pulling themselves up enough. But once factories started closing and the economy changed so drastically that people started to realize, well, geez, you may end up being unemployed through no fault of your own. And so I think that's feeling shifted in the world of unemployment largely. I think we're going through the same thing in housing. That I think more and more as we have experienced one of our parents not being able to keep up their old farmhouse or being stuck on some waiting list to move into an assisted living facility, or if somebody got caught up in the foreclosure crisis. I think just with time, this touches more and more people. And that this feeling or your suggestion, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll be able to afford this home. I think once more people, whether it's a senior or somebody that's disabled or somebody that owns their own home, has sort of fallen through the cracks and really experienced the problem, I think just gradually the feelings will shift. And there's this holding on to that notion, well, just work harder and you'll be able to own your own home. No, the gap's too big. I think it just takes time, frankly. And I think our problem's getting bigger, and I think it's touching more people, and I think the segment will change.
So, if there's no other burning comment anybody would wish to contribute, I want to point out that this fairly large panel all ended 1 minute before their allotted time, which is an incredible achievement. And I must say, I'm really floored and impressed. The content, no, seriously. So it's been a very productive afternoon. There will be a written report, which will be on the SSM website under this session, as previous sessions have done, the last one being food on June 5th. And let's thank our panel for their contribution. And please do check out that website. It's SustainSouthernMaine, nospaces.org. Thank you.